I still remember the night Renata showed up at my door with 2 suitcases and a broken phone screen, crying about a landlord who wouldn't fix her heater. I let her stay for what was supposed to be a week. She ended up staying for almost 2 months. I never once thought to ask questions. She cooked breakfast most mornings, fed biscuit when I forgot, and stayed up with me on the nights deadlines piled too high. It felt normal. It felt like family. During those 2 months, she watched me work more than I realized. She saw how I logged into client systems, how I organized my files, how I typed when I was tired versus when I was focused. I never hid anything from her because I never thought I needed to. She wasn't just a friend sitting nearby, she was someone I treated like an extension of myself. There was a night in March when she asked me, almost casually, how long it would take someone to fake another person's digital footprint convincingly enough to fool a forensic team. I laughed and told her it depended on how well you knew the person's habits. She smiled and said she was just curious, that she'd been reading about cybersecurity cases online. I believed her instantly, because doubting Renata never crossed my mind. Looking back now, I understand that conversation wasn't curiosity. It was research. She also asked me once about my family, specifically about an uncle who used to work security for a private company decades ago. I told her the story without thinking twice, the same way I told her everything. I didn't know then that small, harmless details like that would later be used to build a profile of me convincing enough to hand over to a stranger. What made her betrayal so effective wasn't cleverness on her part alone. It was the years of access I had freely given her. She didn't have to break into my life to study it. I had opened every door myself, one shared secret at a time, never once suspecting that trust could be collected the same way data is collected, quietly, patiently, until there's enough to use. I think about those 2 months often, replaying moments I once considered proof of our friendship. The late-night talks. The way she remembered small details about my past. The way she always seemed to understand me a little too well. At the time, I called it closeness. Now I understand it was observation. By the time she left my apartment that spring, she didn't just take her suitcases with her. She took everything she needed to become me, in the exact moments it would matter most. The freelance gig started the way most bad decisions do, wrapped in something that felt reasonable. Renata sent me a single message asking if I had time for extra work that paid well and asked no questions. I said yes within minutes, because rent was due and I never once thought to question why she was the one bringing me the offer instead of a client contacting me directly. She handled the logistics herself. She gave me a secure link, a login, and a short brief about auditing outdated firewall protocols for a shipping company based somewhere in the Midwest. She told me the client wanted speed over documentation, which struck me as unusual, but not unusual enough to stop me. I remember thinking it was strange that she knew so many details about a client I had never spoken to myself, but I brushed it off as her being thorough. The first 2 days of the audit were uneventful. I found small, ordinary vulnerabilities, outdated encryption, a few exposed ports, nothing that raised alarm. It was the third night, working later than usual with Biscuit curled up beside my keyboard, when I noticed a folder structure that didn't match anything related to shipping software. It was hidden behind 3 layers of encryption that had nothing to do with the assignment I'd been given. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to see what kind of security was protecting something buried that deep. What I found didn't look like shipping records. It looked like financial statements moving between accounts with no clear business purpose, transactions timed strangely, amounts that made no sense for a mid-sized logistics company. I called Renata immediately, my hands unsteady as I explained what I'd stumbled onto. I told her this wasn't a normal audit, that we needed to shut it down and walk away before anyone knew we'd seen anything. She was quiet for a moment, then told me it wasn't that simple anymore. I asked her what she meant. She didn't answer directly. She just repeated that it was too late to back out now. I didn't understand the weight behind those words at the time. I thought she meant we were contractual stuck, or that walking away might cost us the payment we were promised. I had no idea she was talking about a promise she had already made to someone else, using my skills as currency to settle a debt I didn't even know existed. I kept working that week, uneasy but trusting her judgment the way I always had. I didn't know that every keystroke I made inside that system was being quietly logged, studied, and prepared to be used against me the moment it became convenient for someone else's survival. The apartment felt different the moment they stepped inside, like the air itself had changed pressure. One of the men picked up my phone before I could reach for it, sliding it into his jacket pocket without a word. Another walked straight past me toward Biscuit's food bowl, checking the kitchen like he was memorizing the layout of my life. Nobody explained anything. Nobody needed to. I remember trying to speak, asking what this was about, and one of them simply held up a hand, not unkind, just final. Whatever this was, questions weren't part of it yet. My legs felt disconnected from my body as I stood, chopsticks still somehow in my hand until someone gently took them from me and set them on the counter, like even in that moment, some strange politeness was being observed. Outside, a black car waited with its engine already running. No neighbors were on their porches. No one seemed to notice three unfamiliar men escorting a woman out of her apartment on a Tuesday night. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how ordinary the street still looked, as if my entire world hadn't just been rearranged in under 2 minutes. Inside the car, no one spoke to me directly. The two men in front exchanged a few quiet words in a language I didn't understand, while the man beside me stared out his window like I wasn't even there. I kept waiting for someone to explain what I had done, what mistake I had made, but the silence stretched on, heavier than any accusation could have been. I watched the streets of Tulsa blur past, familiar gas stations and diners I passed almost daily, all of it suddenly feeling like it belonged to a life I no longer had access to. I thought about my apartment door, left slightly open behind us, about Biscuit alone inside, about the leftover food still sitting on my coffee table. Somewhere during that drive, I finally let myself think the name that had been repeated to me back in my apartment. Salvatore Reyes. I turned it over in my mind, trying to place it, trying to understand what connection I could possibly have to someone whose name alone made grown men move without hesitation. I didn't cry. I didn't panic the way I expected myself to. I just sat there, watching the city disappear behind tinted windows, waiting to find out what kind of story I had somehow become a part of, without ever agreeing to play a role in it. The room they brought me into wasn't what I expected either. No dim lighting, no dramatic shadows, just an ordinary office with worn carpet and a bookshelf crowded with binders instead of anything menacing. It felt more like walking into an accountant's office than the lair of a man people feared enough to obey without question. I sat in the chair across from his desk because standing felt impossible, my knees still unsteady from the drive over. He didn't raise his voice once during our conversation, which somehow made everything feel more dangerous than if he had. Men who need to shout to be heard aren't usually the ones you should fear the most, and some part of me understood that instinctively, even through the fear clouding my thoughts. When he mentioned the missing money, I felt something shift inside my chest, a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief because finally, someone was naming the accusation out loud instead of leaving me to guess. Terror because I understood, in that moment, exactly how serious this situation actually was. I answered him honestly, without trying to sound clever or rehearsed. I had nothing to hide, which made speaking easier than I expected, even with my voice trembling. I told him about the audit, about the folder I wasn't supposed to find, about telling Renata we needed to stop before it went any further. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable the entire time. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something I hadn't expected from a man in his position, a kind of careful curiosity rather than pure anger. He wasn't just looking for someone to blame. He genuinely wanted to understand what had actually happened inside his own systems. The folder he slid toward me felt heavier than paper should. Seeing my own login credentials staring back at me, timestamps lining up with a crime I knew I hadn't committed, made my stomach turn in a way I hadn't experienced before. It was one thing to know you're innocent. It was another thing entirely to watch evidence insist otherwise, printed neatly, impossible to argue against on its surface. His question hung in the air longer than any threat could have. Someone built this to look like me. Someone who understood my habits well enough to recreate them convincingly. Sitting there, across from a man capable of ending my life with a single word, I realized the real danger wasn't him. It was whoever had studied me closely enough to disappear behind my own identity. The house they kept me in sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by trees thick enough to block any view of the road. A woman named Carol brought me meals 3 times a day and never answered questions beyond simple things, like where the bathroom was or what time dinner would be served. She wasn't unkind, just careful, the way someone is when they've been told exactly how much they're allowed to say. The first few days blurred together in a strange rhythm of waiting. I wasn't given a laptop or phone, but I was given paper and time, endless amounts of it, more than I'd had in years. I found myself replaying every conversation I'd had with Renata in the months leading up to that audit, searching for cracks I might have missed the first time around. On the 4th day, one of Salvatore's men, a quiet, methodical guy named Theo, brought me printouts of the terminal logs from the breach. He said Salvatore wanted my opinion, since I understood the systems better than anyone else on his team. I remember feeling a strange flicker of purpose reading through those logs, something familiar in the middle of everything unfamiliar. That's when I noticed the IP address tied to Denver. I sat with that detail for a long time, turning it over, because I had never once set foot in that city, let alone accessed a client's system from there. My mind immediately searched for logical explanations, a proxy server, a spoofed location, anything that didn't lead toward the conclusion slowly forming at the edges of my thoughts. Then I noticed the typing patterns. Terminal logs capture more than just commands, they capture rhythm, speed, the small human errors people make without thinking. My own logs were always messy, full of backspaces and corrections, a reflection of how quickly my mind moved compared to my fingers. These logs were nothing like that. Clean. Deliberate. Patient in a way I had never been at a keyboard in my life. I spent 2 full days trying to talk myself out of what that meant. I told myself maybe someone had studied old recordings of my screen sharing sessions from client calls. I told myself maybe it was a coincidence, or a skilled stranger who happened to know enough about me to fake these details convincingly. But only one person had spent 2 months watching me work up close, learning my habits without me ever suspecting a reason to hide them. Only one person had unrestricted access to every device I owned during the exact window this breach occurred. By the 5th night in that house, I stopped constructing alternatives. I simply sat with the truth, letting it settle over me the way cold water settles into skin, slow, undeniable, impossible to warm away. The office felt smaller that morning, though nothing about it had physically changed. Salvatore sat across from me with a stillness that made my stomach tighten before he even said a word. I noticed Theo standing near the door, arms crossed, watching me the way someone watches a person they are waiting to see break. When Salvatore mentioned the rented workspace in Denver, I felt my pulse quicken despite already suspecting where this was heading. He explained that his people had pulled security footage from the building, grainy but clear enough to make out a woman entering and leaving at odd hours over several days. The payments for the space had been made in cash, careful and untraceable at first glance, but not careful enough to survive the kind of scrutiny his organization was capable of applying. He told me about the gambling debts almost casually, like he was reading a report rather than describing the collapse of everything I thought I understood about my closest friend. Marcus Denoli's name meant nothing to me at the time, just another stranger tangled into a situation I still couldn't fully process. But the word, debt, landed heavier than anything else in that sentence, because it explained something I hadn't been able to explain on my own: why. Sitting there, I found myself doing math I never wanted to do, counting backward through years of friendship, trying to identify the exact moment closeness had quietly turned into study. I thought about the countless nights she'd sat beside me while I worked, asking questions I'd always assumed came from genuine curiosity. I thought about how easily she'd learned my passwords, not through hacking, but through trust freely given, cup by cup of coffee, secret by secret. Salvatore didn't rush me through the silence that followed. He let me sit with it, watching my face carefully, like he was studying my reaction as closely as he'd studied the evidence itself. I didn't cry, though I expected to. Instead, I felt something colder settle into place, a quiet, exhausted clarity replacing the panic I'd carried for the past 12 days. I asked him, my voice quieter than I intended, why she would choose me specifically out of everyone she knew. He answered without hesitation, like he'd already anticipated the question. Because I was skilled enough to be valuable, and because someone who trusted me completely would never think to protect herself from me. That answer sat heavier in my chest than any threat Salvatore could have made himself. The danger I'd been running from for 12 days hadn't come from strangers or criminals I'd never met. It had come from someone I loved, someone who had turned 4 years of friendship into the perfect blueprint for my undoing. The question left my mouth before I fully decided to ask it, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Salvatore didn't seem surprised by it, like he'd been expecting me to reach this point eventually, once the shock had worn thin enough to make room for practical thinking again. He leaned back in his chair, taking his time before answering, the way someone does when they've already rehearsed the words in their head. He reminded me that Renata was still out there, unaware that her plan had unraveled, still believing she'd successfully traded my life for her own safety. Killing me, he said, would only reward her mistake, closing the case exactly the way she'd designed it to close. Then he shifted the conversation toward my code, tapping the folder again like it was evidence of something more valuable than guilt. He told me his security team had missed the exact vulnerabilities I'd stumbled onto within days, despite years of paid access and expensive resources. He said sloppy instincts that worked were worth more to him than polished skill that missed the obvious. I didn't understand at first where he was steering the conversation, but the shape of it became clearer with every sentence. This wasn't mercy. This was a negotiation disguised as an explanation, each detail laid out carefully to show me exactly what I had to offer him, and exactly what refusing would cost me. He said it plainly after that. My skills, permanently available to him, in exchange for 2 things, my continued safety, and the full truth about what actually happened being made known to the right people. He didn't threaten me directly, but I understood without needing him to spell it out further. There wasn't a version of this conversation where I simply walked away and returned to my old life untouched. I thought about Biscuit, alone in my apartment for 12 days. I thought about my parents, who had no idea where I was or what had happened to me. I thought about Renata, moving freely through her days, confident that her secret was safely buried under my name instead of hers. Saying yes wasn't difficult in the end, not because I trusted Salvatore, but because for the first time since that Tuesday night, someone with real power was finally willing to say my name and Renata's name together, with the truth clearly separating us. That mattered more to me in that moment than any fear I still carried about what working for him might eventually require of me. I found out about Marcus Denoli's removal secondhand, through a brief comment Theo made while driving me back into the city on the 12th day. He mentioned it the way someone mentions the weather, factual and detached, offering no further explanation when I asked what removed actually meant. I decided quickly that some answers were better left unasked, and I never brought it up again. For weeks afterward, I waited for something dramatic to happen involving Renata, some visible sign that consequences were catching up to her the way they'd caught up to me. Nothing like that ever came. No police showed up at her door. No headlines mentioned her name. Whatever happened to settle her debt happened quietly, somewhere outside my view, in a world I no longer had access to and honestly didn't want back. I moved out of my old apartment 2 months after returning to my normal life, unable to shake the feeling of her presence still lingering in every room she'd once occupied. I packed slowly, finding small things that used to feel meaningful, a coffee mug she'd left behind, a note she'd once written on my fridge in her handwriting. I threw most of it away without much ceremony, though a few pieces I kept, unsure why. The gas station encounter happened on a Sunday afternoon, completely unplanned, the kind of coincidence life sometimes forces on you without warning. I was filling my tank when I noticed her standing near the entrance, her frame smaller than I remembered, dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of exhaustion no makeup could hide. For a moment, neither of us moved. I felt my chest tighten, waiting for anger to rise up the way I expected it to, the kind of anger people write songs and speeches about. Instead, I just felt hollow, staring at someone I used to know completely, now reduced to a stranger standing 20 feet away. She looked away first, climbing into her car without a word, without an apology, without anything resembling closure. I stood there long after she drove off, gripping the gas pump handle, trying to understand why I didn't feel more satisfied watching her disappear from my life for good. Driving home that evening, I realized triumph was never something this situation was going to offer me. What I felt instead was quieter, heavier, the particular exhaustion that comes from losing someone you love to a version of themselves you never saw coming, and grieving a friendship you now understood had never fully existed the way you believed it had. The city I live in now stays unnamed even in my own thoughts, a habit I picked up without realizing it, like some part of me is still protecting the location out of instinct. My apartment is smaller than the one in Tulsa, sparser too, furnished with only what I need rather than what makes a space feel like home. I've learned that home isn't something furniture creates anyway. My work looks different now, though the core of it hasn't changed much. I still spend long hours in front of a screen, still find satisfaction in identifying weaknesses before someone else can exploit them. The difference is who I work for, and the fact that the stakes attached to my mistakes now carry weight I never had to consider back when my biggest worry was disappointing a small business client. I adopted another cat about 8 months ago, a stray who showed up outside my building during a storm. I didn't name her Biscuit. It felt important, somehow, to let this new chapter have its own identity, separate from everything that came before it. She sleeps beside my keyboard most nights, the same way Biscuit used to, and I try not to think too hard about what that similarity means. Trust doesn't come easily to me anymore, not the way it used to. I find myself analyzing new relationships the way I used to analyze code, searching for vulnerabilities before they can be exploited, watching for patterns that don't quite add up. It's exhausting, living this way, but it feels safer than the alternative. I still think about the version of myself who existed before that Tuesday night, the woman who trusted freely, who never once considered that closeness could be weaponized. I don't know if I miss her exactly, but I understand her differently now, with a kind of tired compassion for how naive she was, though naive isn't really the right word for someone who simply believed the people she loved. What stays with me most isn't the fear, though that lingers too. It's the quiet, persistent work of rebuilding trust in myself, learning to believe my own instincts again after they were manipulated so completely by someone I never suspected. Some days that work feels finished. Other days, it feels like it's only just beginning. There are nights even now when I replay that first scene in my head, unprompted, arriving in the middle of ordinary moments like washing dishes or waiting at a red light. The chopsticks. The stunned silence. The strange politeness of men who could have hurt me but chose not to. I don't think that memory will ever fully lose its grip on me, and I've stopped expecting it to. What stays with me longer than the fear, though, is the exact moment Salvatore asked me who I thought had done this. I remember the silence that followed his question, how empty my mind felt trying to search for an answer I didn't yet have the courage to name. That silence taught me something important, something I didn't fully understand until much later. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden from us. Sometimes we simply aren't ready yet to look directly at it. I've thought a lot about why Renata's betrayal cut deeper than the danger itself. Strangers are easy to fear. We build instincts for that kind of threat instinctively, from childhood, without needing to be taught. But no one prepares you for the version of harm that arrives disguised as comfort, that spends years earning the right to know you completely before ever using that knowledge against you. I used to believe survival meant becoming harder, colder, less willing to let anyone close enough to hurt me again. I don't believe that anymore. Real survival, the kind that actually heals something, meant learning to trust my own judgment again, slowly, deliberately, the same careful way I now approach every line of code I write. Salvatore didn't save me because he was kind. He saved me because he recognized something valuable in a moment where everyone else only saw a convenient villain. But the real turning point in my life wasn't his decision. It was mine, the quiet choice I made afterward to keep believing in my own instincts, even after they'd been so thoroughly manipulated by someone I loved. I'm not the same person who once opened every door of her life without question. I'm more careful now, more deliberate, occasionally even a little colder than I'd like to admit. But I'm still here, still building, still choosing to trust selectively rather than not at all. That, to me, feels like the real victory in this story, quieter than revenge, but far more lasting. If this story meant something to you, stay with me. Subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.